You're listening to School Counseling Simplified, a podcast with easy-to-implement strategies for busy school counselors. Here's your host, Rachel Davis from Bright Futures Counseling.
Hey there, I hope you're having a great day. Thank you for listening to another episode of School Counseling Simplified. So as you know, we have been focusing so much on productivity recently as I was launching my stress-free school counseling course. So enrollment has closed and I'm so happy to welcome all of my new members. Thank you for those of you who decided to join me as we transform our counseling programs together. If you did not decide that this was right for you at this time but want some more information, we do have a wait list going for next time. Or if you're not sure what I'm talking about, just head over to stressfreeschoolcounseling.com and you can jump on the wait list for the next time we launch. But because we have wrapped that up, I now am shifting our focus these last 2 weeks of January. I want to talk to you about grief. So grief is definitely not the most fun topic to talk about, but it is very relevant. I know many of your students are experiencing it, and especially in our society today with the pandemic, I know many of you are looking for grief resources more than ever. So I definitely want to address it here over the next couple of weeks. So today I want to talk to you about how you can counsel students through grief at the Tier 1 class intervention level. So these are those class SEL or class guidance lessons that you're doing. And there's 2 cases where you would be doing a lesson like this. So the first case, this is the one I'm going to talk about today and that I'm encouraging you to do, is a preventative piece. So that's where you're going to go into classrooms and teach about grief. This way the students are familiar with the terms, they know what it is, and they can identify how to deal with it in advance so when something does occur, they feel prepared. The second way it would be an active response, and that is if something has happened at your school. So maybe a student or a staff member has passed away, and then you're going into going into classrooms doing these lessons. So those are a little different. That's the active response. But today I want to talk to you about the preventative response. So this is a lesson that you can do ahead of time to kind of equip students with the skills that they need. So that way, if and when something does occur, they feel prepared. And then you go in and do that active response lesson, but they already have a basis. You're not going in and saying, let's define grief right in the midst of it, if that makes sense. So let me tell you a few tips for doing these preventative grief lessons. So the first thing I want you to do is educate students about what grief is. So you need to define grief. Many students, especially our younger ones, probably don't know what this means. So you can discuss what it means to grieve something. You can discuss how you can grieve death or loss or separation. It doesn't always have to be directly death. It could be like incarceration or divorce or anything, but primarily focusing on death and loss. And then after you define it, you can answer any questions students may have about exactly what grief means. Then you want to talk about how it manifests itself in different ways. So you want to talk to students about how sad is not the only emotion that is linked with grief. Oftentimes it is anger, or it is fear, or it is frustration, or maybe sometimes it's silliness. Primarily fear and anger are big ones that go hand in hand with sadness. And many times students just automatically think grief, death equals sad. So we want to clarify that grief manifests itself in different ways. There is no wrong way to feel. There are no bad emotions. And you want to normalize this experience because a student listening in the classroom may have experienced loss already and they may be able to relate and say, it was okay for me to feel that way. So you want to definitely normalize those feelings and let them know that there are no bad emotions. So after you do that, you want to say that healing is not linear. So you can use a visual to show, oftentimes we think of something like an arrow going up. If you're looking at a graph, like over time, things are improving, but that's not the case with grief. You want to explain to them that it is like a roller coaster. So that's a great analogy to use with the little guys, how there are many ups and downs and how you're not necessarily getting better or feeling better each day and each month. But instead, some days are great and some days are really hard. And you might just wake up feeling like you're going to have a really hard day, or maybe something makes you think about your loss and that triggers it. Either way, you want to let them know that there is no direct path to healing, and that it is a process, not a clear progress. Okay? So we want to, number one, educate them on what grief is. Number two, discuss the emotions associated with grief and how they manifest in different ways, and that is okay. And then you want to talk about how healing is not a straight path, but rather a roller coaster. Now, the next thing you want to talk about is how they can talk to people who are experiencing grief. So if they have a classmate who had a relative pass away, how can they talk to that person? So 9 times out of 10, most students want to feel normal and they don't want special attention from their friends regarding their loss because they're already hurting and they don't want it to be called out anymore. So you can tell them they can make a nice card, or they can tell their friend, offer them their support, and if they want to talk about it, but then kind of back off and just treat them normal because that's likely what they're craving. So it's important to tell the students how they can interact with people who are experiencing grief. Next, you want them to identify a support system. So this is a huge step. So you want them to, I like to use a flip book or something like that, or if you're virtual, they can make a chart. But you want them to identify people at a school, at home, and in the community who they can talk to if they are experiencing grief. So you want to make sure that they know you, the school counselor. It's someone that they can talk to anytime about grief, but you also want them to identify more than one person at school. So perhaps it's the teacher or the principal or the secretary, yard duty. There's a variety of people, but have them identify, try to get 3 people per category. And then the second area is at home. So you want them to identify maybe some family members or neighbors, aunts, grandparents, mom, dad, people they can talk to, siblings. And then the third area is the community. So these are people who are not at home and not at school. So perhaps if they are in church or a religious organization, it could be someone there that they could identify. If they do any sports outside of school, maybe it's a coach. Or if they are in any clubs like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, maybe it's a leader there. So you want them to identify people. Friends are okay, but adults are best. More than one person in each category. Now, this piece is so important to do in a preventative lesson because once something happens and students are grieving, it's going to be, their thinking's a little clouded and it's harder to identify those people they can go to for support. It's best if they already have it written down and they can reference it and use it when needed. And then you can have students share experiences of grief. So you can ask for volunteers to talk about a time that they experienced grief and what they did. And this is a great way to segue into the final point, which is to teach them possible coping strategies. So you can have students share how they've coped with grief in the past, and then you can discuss other coping strategies that they can use. So these are going to be like, exercise, talk to a friend, get a drink of water, take deep breaths, anything that they can identify. Maybe it's journaling or writing a song. So maybe they're going like a creative outlet, or maybe they're doing a physical outlet like movement or exercise. So there's a variety of coping strategies. So this is a great time to talk to them about those. So again, this is for those preventative lessons on grief. So you can go into classrooms in advance. So hopefully, your school doesn't experience a traumatic event and everyone's not grieving together. But these are just good life skills to have because death and loss is inevitable and students are likely going to experience grief at some point, and it's best if they feel prepared to deal with it. So again, start that lesson by educating them on what grief is, talking about what it looks like, how it manifests itself in different ways. You want to be sure to touch on how all of those emotions can vary and different people experience different emotions when processing grief. You also want to explain that it is indeed a process and not a linear progression of improvement, but rather a roller coaster. You then want to give them tips on how to talk to classmates who are experiencing grief and how to give them space while showing them support. And then you want to help them identify their own support system, so people in their home, school, and community that they can go to when they are experiencing grief. And then you want to give them the opportunity to share if they feel comfortable sharing a time that they've experienced grief. So whether it's with a pet or a grandparent or even a mom or dad or whatever they feel comfortable, open the space for sharing, and then they can talk about how they responded. which helps you segue into the final point, which are those coping strategies you want to equip them with. So if faced with the situation, they know what to do. So again, this is a proactive preventative lesson that you can do in classes to help kiddos feel prepared when they do inevitably encounter grief. This does look a little different from, if something happened at your school and there was a loss of a student or a staff member, that's going to be an entirely different lesson. But this is one I wanted to share with you today on how to be preventative and get ahead of it. I hope you found this helpful. Next week, I will be talking to you about how you can help students cope with grief in small groups and individual settings. Okay, I'll talk to you then.
Thanks for listening to School Counseling Simplified. You can find the links from today's episode in the show notes. If you'd like to connect with Rachel, she's on Instagram and Teachers Pay Teachers at Bright Futures Counseling. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes of School Counseling Simplified. Talk to you next week.